Europe needs an army. But why? Si vis pacem, para bellum. If you seek peace, prepare for war. This should also be the motto of Europe's army. After centuries, even millennia of constant warfare, we have finally arrived in a time of peace and prosperity, and we would like to keep it. There are not many nations in Europe calling for the blood of other nations anymore. None of them in the European Union. Even between the Germans and the French a warm friendship has been established, after being mortal enemies for so long. There are still some scars left of the last bloody wars, and some would like a change in borders in some places or others. But nobody seems to be willing to sacrifice our current prosperity for the vain glory of conquering a strip of land he could settle if he wanted by simply moving to the country, technically owning it with minimal opposition of said country. The only reason left to conquer is national pride, a feeling that something should belong to your nation for historic reasons. But let's be real. Every single nation in Europe has those issues. Some country took some land in another century. So what? This should no longer be a reason to go to war over. Are we not a civilized people? Can't we accept to let bygones be bygones? To move into another century of mutual well-being? I'm getting slightly off topic, but it is essential to understand the current and hopefully eternal peaceful relations between the nations of the European Union before we start to talk about a common army. And I'm talking about an army of the European Union, just to make sure to get this point across. The simple problem is we are not alone on this globe. There are nations on Europe's borders that have proven over the last couple of years that they will take any showing of weakness as an invitation to expand their borders or show off their military prowess. Russia has invaded the Ukraine. Turkey has taken over part of Syria, with nobody knowing if they will give it back once Syria is a stable nation again. Both Russia and Turkey are bordering on nations of the European Union. And only one thing is certain. Once things go south in a dictatorship, outer enemies are easy to find, and if they can defend themselves, well, I'll just point to the Ukraine and Syria. Then there's of course the powder keg known as the Balkan, of which some nations have become members of the European Union. Not to mention North Africa, of which some nations are still in a state of civil war with uncertain outcome, possibly leading to extremely hostile relations between them and Europe. The Islamist danger lurking in the Middle East should also never be underestimated. This should cover most immediate military threats to European nations. So, disbanding our militaries, which would have seemed like a feasible idea considering the rosy image I painted previously, is not an option. But why an European army? Why not just keep national armies? Well, it's cheaper, more efficient, and more powerful than over 20 rather small armies with various levels of equipment, training, and manpower. To explain the problem of a splintered force, let me give you a number. The nations of the European Union currently spend a bit over 200 billion euro a year, which is roundabout half as much as the US, more than thrice as much as Russia, and almost as much as China. But Europe hasn't been considered a military powerhouse for decades, while those nations are for sure. Even worse, our politicians have settled on the notion that the NATO will come riding to our aid once something currently unthinkable happens, meaning of course the US should come to our aid. First of all, that's beyond shameful for the potentially wealthiest continent to rely on an outside force for defense, and secondly, after the US has announced, rightfully so, to no longer wanting to be the world's policeman, we are no longer sure if that help will manifest if, for example, Turkey, or rather Erdogan, decided he wants a bigger piece of the European side of the Bosporus. Now, why do we have so little military power? Let me give you an example. The US has the M1 Abrams. The European Union has a dozen or so different battle tanks. Not to mention assault rifles, pistols, sniper rifles, artillery pieces, air superiority fighters, you name it. Development and production are splintered between the nations and manufacturers, making every single piece even more expensive than it needs to be for low quantities of production and high development costs. A European tank, European assault rifle, etc. would solve that problem in an instant. One could ask the various military producers in the world, preferably of course in Europe, to hand in their best designs and choose the best and equip the European armies and the European army, note the distinction, with said weapons. This process would obviously take decades, but it would make any soldier in the European Union capable of operating equipment of any nation's army, given that he's been trained in that role of combat. I will get to the whole national versus European army thing in a moment. The European arms cooperation has already been done successfully with the Eurofighter, and as long as you keep most lobbying out of the process, it would probably be quite successful with other equipment. So, standardizing Europe's armies is the first step to a cheaper, more efficient European military. So, the next step would be national specialization. Right now, most nations have their own little tank battalions and air squadrons. Usually, those are way too small to do anything useful. There are many nations that can't even accelerate their planes to full speed without breaching another nation's borders, and there are nations that can count their functional battle tanks on a single man's fingers. But then there are of course nations that have specialists few other nations can offer. For example, the Austrian mountain troops or the German mine divers. A European army would make use of all those specialists, and if you volunteer, you should be given a chance to join one of those elites, given you're physically and mentally able to get into them. But to explain this idea, for example, the German army could focus on tanks and mechanized infantry, while the French focus on the air force, and smaller nations focus on more specialized units, like the mentioned mountain troops, paratroopers, combat divers, chemical and nuclear defense units, you name it. This would create a more focused military endeavor in the nations, combining all of those cogs into a greater European war machine if necessary, and only if necessary. Countries could still keep their other parts of the army, but as they are already usually far too small or ill-equipped, I would bet some of the more expensive ones would be dissolved rather quickly. About efficiency, I can only say that a continent-spanning army with central coordination centers will inevitably be more efficient when trying to achieve anything than dozens of only reluctantly communicating national armies. Even if we currently had an incident in Europe where the deployment of troops in combat situations was necessary and multiple nations would send their troops, the inter-army communication would be hampered for many reasons, be they technical, psychological, or due to enemy action. Throw in a dozen languages and terrible accents of English, you will soon be happy to not have to deal with any other nation's army and just keep contact to not accidentally shoot at one another. Of course, every single officer in the European army would have to be fluent in a common language, preferably English, and even the common infantryman of Poland should be able to understand the Frenchman next to him. Now, let's get to the issue of deployment and mandate, because the nationalistic man of the internet will bring up how this army would either be used to immediately invade the Brits or squash anti-European Union protests and whatnot. Probably also how it will be composed of only Muslim migrants who have no hesitation to shoot Europeans. So let me get this straight. A European army can only exist in defense of the member states from outside forces. This should be its primary mandate. Whenever a nation calls for help against invaders, there should be no political discussion. The call for help should be enough to immediately mobilize the army. Obviously, such a call must be justifiable, but in times of war, time is of the essence, and we can't risk the territorial integrity of European nations for pointless political bickering in Brussels. This obviously requires a structure of generals who are aware of what is expected from them in such a case, who don't ask for the European Parliament's, the Commission's and the Council's permission first when called to aid a nation in need, and only in that case. Secondly, deploying European forces with a peacekeeping mandate from the UN shouldn't be a problem either, since many European nations are doing that already all the time. Another reason to deploy parts of the European army may be the securing of Europeans being taken hostage in other nations and preferably eliminating the threat permanently. But this is something a Council of the member nations should decide. For example, a vote of Ministers of Defense of Europe or Ministers of Outer Affairs, since it is not an immediate military threat. This is naturally a measure of last resort if the nation in which our people are held are not cooperative. Another reason to deploy could be natural disasters, helping out the local forces and doing some image work for the European army. What should be made impossible is the deployment of the European army against Europeans. Period. Right on the first page of its mandate, it should say deployment against any civil unrest, any protest, or against people of Europe in whatever fashion is not permissible, no matter what. This excludes, of course, guard duty in the various nations if they wish to disband their military entirely, and leave it up to the European army to stand guard at the nation's buildings of government and other such things. The same goes for guarding their military compounds. Worst case scenario, they would have to shoot someone trying to trespass on military areas. Then it is important to mention that the European army should not be allowed to be an aggressive force, meaning invading a neighboring nation is out of the question. However, if we are under attack, there should be no hesitation to cross into the territory of whoever was attacking us and making sure they won't ever try it again. I'm not formulating an entire code of deployment and mandate here, for I am no man of the law, but I think I've made myself clear. So, who is in charge? Generals, obviously, but the more important issue, who is politically in charge? I would propose the heads of the various countries in matters of war and peace, making decisions after the army has already been deployed by the simple application of the mentioned mandate. That would be the European Council. Potentially, the European Parliament could also be in charge, as those people are voted for by the people of Europe. The Commission should not, I repeat, not be in charge, but they are already seen as unelected by the public and can be chosen by the national governments, divorcing them quite far from the people. If the chief commissioner would be voted for by the European public, things could be different, potentially making him the supreme commander. The day-to-day business could be dealt with by the Council of Ministers of Defense of Europe, in accordance with a military commissioner. Day-to-day business meaning deployment in peacekeeping missions, limited saving operations for Europeans, or in support against natural disasters. Now let's talk about national armies and the European army. As said previously, keeping a national army should be perfectly fine, but it should slowly be equipped with European standard equipment, which therefore needs to be better or equal to what they already have, to make it worthwhile. This is to make a transfer of forces from national armies to the European army a matter of bureaucracy and nothing more. What nations do with their own forces is of course up to them, but the cooperation with the European army, for example a seconding of forces or even single soldiers to the European army for a set amount of time, should be heavily incentivized. Those national armies could still be used against protesters upon the order of the national government, But let's just say we Europeans generally take a very dim view to those who do such things, and there are measures already in place to prevent this very thing by applying pressure on said government. The national armies could also be called to aid the European army in cases of crisis, expanding the numbers quite a bit. And those men and women would not need any more training with their equipment, but could, worst case scenario again, be thrown right into the thick of the fight. The European army should maybe number something along the lines of 100,000 to 500,000 soldiers, depending upon how large the remaining national forces would be. This is still way below the numbers of Russia and the US, but sizable enough to become a serious player on the world stage again and defend itself on its own terms if the need arises. Let's lastly talk about the opponents of such an army. All the people who want to go back to single European nations with no cooperation and no power on the world stage are amongst the first to argue against the European army. In short, nationalists. Frankly, I'm against being a group of powerless but immensely proud dwarfs hoping for the American giant to come to our aid whenever we need him. I'd much rather have an alliance that will unquestionably help each other as the automated response to outside threats, requiring no further political bickering and bribing, after the rules are set up when to deploy. Then there are of course all the other superpowers, the US and with it the organization called NATO, Russia, China, potentially India, and maybe even the UK, even if the last one is no superpower anymore. They will find all kinds of reasons, be it the threat such an army poses to the world, how it is against countless international agreements and surely countless other arguments to prevent Europe from rising to the status of a global player in the military game and not a pawn anymore. Envy and fear will drive them, and I say, let them rail against us. We are a free continent, a free union, and we are free to do whatever we want, no matter what Putin, Trump, or Jinping demand. If they threaten us with violence or embargoes, that's just one more reason to establish our own military. Should Europe comply when being threatened? I don't think so. That's not the way of our continent. Finally, there are those within our countries arguing for a peaceful continent, a neutral continent, neutral countries like my own, Austria. To those I can only say, peace and freedom undefended are peace and freedom lost already. We can do it ourselves, or be forever subservient to the US. Europe will finally decide for itself if any military action is needed, but Europe also needs to defend its right to stay outside of conflict, not to be coerced into bombing some Middle Eastern country like some nations have been in the past. If we bomb someone or something, it shall be out of our own volition and only in defense of Europe. I can only make myself clear once more. I don't wish for Europe to ever have to use that army in a war. But I will finish this video as I have started it. Si vis pacem, para bellum. Good night.